Welcome to Survival Stories Death Valley Pioneers, a survival novel set in Death Valley, California. Written by Doug Richardson. Narrated by Bo Carson. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. The Call of the West.
I was born in St. Albans, Vermont, a small town near the eastern shore of Lake Champlain, just a stone's throw south of 45 degrees, the dividing line between the United States and Canada, and a mere 60 or 70 miles from the sprawling metropolis of Montreal and the majestic St. Lawrence River. It was here, on April the 6th, 1820, that I made my grand entry into this world, according to the official record. As a child, I gazed out across the shimmering waters of the narrow lake towards the undulating slopes of the Adirondack Mountains in New York, their emerald-green peaks an alluring vision to a young boy growing up in the verdant hills of Vermont. By the year 1828, wild rumors of the far-off western frontier began to spread like wildfire throughout the countryside. Ohio, in particular, was on everyone's lips, and all we knew was that it was a vast and distant land, accessible only by means of a long, arduous journey by wagon, pulled by oxen or horses, across a seemingly endless expanse of rough terrain. Yet more than one of my kin, including my Uncle James Webster and my own father, came down with a severe case of Western fever, as they called it, after hearing the thrilling tales of intrepid travelers who'd returned from the region with glowing reports of its boundless prosperity and unspoiled natural beauty. With equal measures of hope and trepidation, they sold their farms, packed up all their worldly possessions, and set their sights on the distant West, determined to make a new life for themselves in this fabled land of opportunity. Uncle James was to lead the way, departing in the fall of 1829 with a sturdy wagon drawn by a pair of sturdy horses, carrying all the necessary provisions for the long journey ahead. Father and the rest of the family were to follow in the spring. In readiness, Father had recently purchased a splendid Morgan mare, along with a lightweight wagon that he planned to use as a family carriage. Amazingly, he decided to entrust me, his young son, with the care of the horse and wagon, to accompany Uncle James on the first leg of the journey. Father and Mother would make their way to the western frontier by water, either down the St. Lawrence River and across the Great Lakes, or by way of the newly constructed Erie Canal that stretched across New York State from Albany to Buffalo. And so it was that we loaded up the little wagon with some familiar household items such as a treasured brass kettle, a generous supply of warm blankets and bedding, and even a quilt to use as a cushion. The commissary chest, filled with a carefully selected array of food and other essential sundries, was stowed neatly under the wagon seat, ensuring our continued comfort and welfare throughout the long and grueling journey ahead. I was just a young boy, not even 10 years old, setting out into an unknown land. As you could imagine, I was quite the center of attention. Everyone gathered around to bid me farewell, but it was my mother who seemed the most concerned. She gave me instructions to be a good boy and take care of myself until her return in the spring. I could feel her love as she embraced me and held me close, kissing my forehead repeatedly. Eventually they lifted me onto the spring seat and I took hold of the reins, my little whip with a leather lash at my side. Just before we parted ways, my father handed me a small purse of copper cents, and we were on our way. We journeyed southwards, through St. Albans, with Lake Champlain visible in the distance. Uncle and Aunt often spoke to me and pointed out the sights, trying to keep me from feeling homesick. Fortunately, the horse was experienced and knew how to navigate the large stones and stumps in the road. It was as if we were a team, the horse and I, working together to reach our destination. Our plan was to stay with any hospitable farmers we could find along the way. We were never turned away and often treated to free bread and milk for supper. There were no hotels or taverns outside the towns, but we didn't need them. It was just us, our trusty horse, and the kindness of strangers. In time, we arrived at Whitehall, located at the head of Lake Champlain. The weighty box in Uncle's wagon became burdensome as we traveled down muddy roads. Thus he had it placed on a canal boat to be shipped to Cleveland, which made our journey much smoother. The path we took usually brought us close to either the Champlain or Erie Canal, which afforded me a glimpse into the life of the canal boys. The boy who drove the horses leading the packet boat was always neatly attired and rode at a swift pace, while the freight driver was typically barefoot and clothed in tattered rags. When the weather grew too chilly to ride, he strolled alongside his team, hurling stones or sticks at them and offering constant verbal abuse towards the packet boy, cursing as long as he remained within earshot. Having been raised the way I was, I concluded that we were moving closer to a particularly wicked part of the world. As we made our way along, we encountered a small village filled with inexpensive dwellings located near the canal. The men there spoke coarsely and loudly while lounging about the saloon, many smoking pipes and dressed poorly, no doubt worsened by whiskey consumption. The children we saw were scantily clothed barefoot and lacking hats. Moreover, the area appeared disgustingly unclean around the doorways of their shanties. Pigs, ducks, and geese loitered precisely at the door, and the women wore dresses that seemed to make no attempt to avoid the mud and voluminous brogan shoes. Their style of speech was considerably insolent and unlike anything I had heard from a woman before. They informed me that they were from Ireland, which was the first time I had seen such people. Somewhere along that path I misplaced my little whip, and obtaining a replacement, depleted a large quantity of the meager allowance my father had given me. We proceeded steadily day after day, with no reason to rush, since there was no way to hasten our journey. The roads were caked with mud, and the log paths were so rough that we had to keep a moderate pace to avoid any trouble. We never journeyed on the sacred day of Sunday. However, one Saturday evening my uncle had the good fortune of persuading a wealthy farmer to let us stay at his place until Monday. We brought our own food and bedding, but welcomed the opportunity to utilize the farmer's kitchen and indulge in some fresh milk and vegetables. After supper everyone took to their books, and even the children remained pin-drop quiet until it was time to retire for the night. When Sunday evening rolled around, the women took out their knitting and sewing, while the children ran amok, breaking the Sabbath with as much fervor as they had observed a pious Saturday night. I had never seen such behavior before, and asked my uncle, to which he replied that they were probably Seventh-day Baptists. After many days of tiresome travel, we finally arrived at Cleveland, situated on Lake Erie. Here my uncle picked up his box of wares and loaded it back onto the wagon. We made our way through relentless rain and mud, barely making any headway for the next few days. Finally, at a Four Corners in Medina County, someone informed us that we were only 21 miles from Cleveland. We reached a small town comprising of a hotel, store, church, schoolhouse, and blacksmith shop. And as the weather was turning cold and nasty, my uncle decided to halt our journey there. He rented a room for himself and my aunt, while I found lodging with Daniel Stevens's boy, whose house was close by. We made sure that our horses were comfortably stabled for the duration of our stay. I enrolled in the local district school, where I studied reading, spelling, and Colburn's mental arithmetic. The lessons commenced smoothly, asking simple questions like, "How many fingers are on your right hand? How many on your left?" before becoming more complex as time passed. My uncle was a man of many skills, but chopping wood was his bread and butter. As the snow began to melt, he scoured the land for a farm that my father and I could call home. But alas, he came up empty-handed. It was then that my father received a letter from his friend Cornish. In it, he shared the news that the government was selling good land in Michigan Territory, free from all timber. It was a chance for us to secure the land we needed with the little capital we had. As soon as the waterways were clear, we were off to Michigan. Our first obstacle came when we arrived at Huron River. It had swollen and burst its banks, leaving us stranded. The road ahead was a nightmare of logs and rails, but we pressed on and found ourselves in town. There we asked about the road to Detroit, only to be told that it was a 30-mile-wide, impassable swamp known as the Maumee or Black Swamp. Thankfully, we were advised to take the waterway instead. When a steamboat bound for Detroit arrived, we wasted no time. Our wagons and horses were loaded up, and we made ourselves comfortable on the lower deck. With our own food and bedding, we were happy to have escaped the squelching mud beneath our feet.
Chapter 2, New Country.
We arrived in Detroit safe and sound, and soon landed our wagons and goods before setting off in a westerly direction. The road was a treacherous one, muddy and punctured with stumps and log bridges, which made our pace painfully slow. It wasn't until we had been on the road for about 30 miles near Ypsilanti that the dense forest began to thin out and give way to what they called oak openings, and we found the going less strenuous on the sandier paths. When we arrived at McCracken's Tavern, we began to inquire about Ebenezer Manley and his family. It didn't take long for us to be directed to a large house nearby where they were staying temporarily. We drove up to the door, and as we emerged from the wagon, they all came out to see who the new arrivals were. My mother spotted me first and ran towards me with open arms. She hugged and kissed me, tears streaming down her face. She held me at arm's length, looking into my eyes, and repeatedly said, "I'm so glad to have you back. You're our little man. You've come such a long way, bringing us our good horse and wagon." My older sister Polly waited patiently beside us. When Mother finally turned to speak to the others, Polly took my arm and led me away. We had never been apart before in all our lives, and we loved each other as siblings should, bonded by good morals and principles and a deep love for our family. The whole family gathered by the side of the house to catch up on our experiences on the long journey by land and water. As the sun went down, we were called to supper and walked hand in hand to surround the bountiful table once again. During supper, Father surprised me by saying, "Louis, I have bought you a smooth bore rifle suitable for either ball or shot." I was thrilled and thankful, thinking that it was good enough for anyone. We spent the greater part of the night talking about our adventures since leaving Vermont, and the young and old alike forgot about sleep. The next day, Pa and Uncle climbed aboard our horse-drawn wagon and set out to find some government land. They reunited with an old friend in Jackson County who showed them a vast expanse of government land surrounding his property. After diligently searching for the section corner, they located the perfect lots, 200 acres in all. With excitement in their hearts, they made their way to the Detroit Land Office and secured the pieces they had chosen. Pa wasted no time in preparing for our journey west. He purchased a sturdy wagon, a pair of strong oxen, and a cow to provide us with milk. Once we were all loaded up, our little emigrant train began the trek to our new home. We happily arrived safe and sound a few days later and secured a modest house to live in about a mile away from our land. Soon, we were hard at work constructing our new home. With determination in our hearts, we built not one, but 2 log houses. To supplement our land, we hired a team of oxen and a strong plow to break 10 acres of ground, no small feat. Trees, small brush, old limbs, and logs dotted the earth, which we cleared away as we tilled the soil. Our homes went up quickly, with each rough oak log carefully selected and hewn by our own hands. For flooring, we opted for oak puncheons or hewed planks, and for the roof, we fashioned oak shakes. Heavy poles held down the shakes as we had no nails. Our split-stuff door hung on wooden hinges, while the fireplace was built of stone and laid up with logs. From the loft floor upwards, the chimney was built of split stuff, heavily plastered with mud. With only a small 4-paned window, our houses were humble but sturdy. We constructed a log barn to shelter our oxen, cow, and horse, and soon added pigs, sheep, and chickens to our growing farm. Our dreams were taking shape, and we worked tirelessly to make them a reality. With haste and determination, my father and uncle set to work fencing in the land we planned to cultivate. My younger brother and I eagerly offered our assistance, grasping the rails at opposite ends and laying them 4 high. It was all we small lads could manage, but we did so diligently. In the span of 2 or 3 years, we had transformed the land into a fertile farm, producing a bounty of wheat, corn, and potatoes, along with an impressive garden. We were blessed with the discovery of ripe wild cranberries and whortleberries, which we promptly dried for winter usage. The nearby lakes yielded an abundance of black bass and pickerel, while the forest around us was teeming with deer, turkeys, pheasants, and pigeons. With my new gun in hand, I became quite skilled at hunting small game for our table. My father and uncle would occasionally bring down a deer, and when the Indians came along, we even had the opportunity to purchase venison. One autumn evening, after the workday was done, my father approached me with an unusual request. "Now, Louis, I want you to hunt every day," he said. "Come home nights, but keep on till you kill a deer." With his permission and a sense of pride swelling within me, I set out the next day with my gun slung over my shoulder. It wasn't long before I spotted some deer in a dense thicket. In a burst of frenzied energy, they leaped high over the oak bushes and out of sight. I quickly raised my gun and took aim at the fleeing animal, firing hastily as it passed out of sight. Loading my gun as quickly as I could, I followed in pursuit, eager to see the fruits of my labor. It wasn't long before I found it. The deer lay lifeless with a bullet hole in its head. I was shocked at my own success, for it was little more than a random shot. But I felt proud and fortunate nonetheless. I began to believe in my hunting abilities, though deep down I knew it was nothing more than pure luck. It took some time before luck was on my side again. My father would occasionally inquire, "Can't you bring us another deer?" I admitted that when I slowly approached a sleeping deer, I became so nervous that I couldn't hit an ox at close range. "Oh," he said, "you get buck fever. Don't be so scared. They won't attack you." As time passed, the fever subsided and my steady hand could hit anything within reach. We were content and happy now. My father could clearly distinguish the difference between Vermont and where we were. There the land was feeble and full of stones, with severe winters. Here there were no rocks to plow, and the land was straightforward to till. We could grow anything, and the wheat bread was far superior to the old rye and Indian. The stunning white bread was tasty enough to eat without butter, and compared to our old place it felt like paradise. Nevertheless, the West kept beckoning me. Chapter 3. The Journey Continues. I set out on my journey west once again, but first had to make a stop in Southport to retrieve the clothes we left behind in the spring. It was a chilly morning with the break of day just peering over the horizon as I began my trek. I carried nothing but a cane in each hand to aid in my journey, not even a coat to shield me from the elements. The road was new and sparsely settled, with only a few log houses in the process of being built. By noon I stopped at a house and indulged in a bowl of bread and milk before continuing on my way. The final 20-mile stretch proved to be a clear prairie, with houses few and far between. As I neared Lake Michigan, I found the land slightly more occupied. It was dark by the time I reached town, and after checking into a local tavern, I learned that the warehouse holding our clothes had been robbed and everything was taken. I was now unencumbered, with nothing to weigh me down on my return journey. I had covered a staggering 60 miles in that one day and felt the pain of my efforts as I rested. It took me 3 days to make my return trek, feeling the soreness in my limbs and the emptiness of my pockets. Now rested and ready to set out on my western journey once again, I knew I could not leave my pet deer behind. It had become domesticated under my care, and I could not simply abandon it to the wilds. So I decided to take its life and present my friends with some tasty venison. Setting out on a new route, I wanted to explore the full breadth of this vast territory. I had always admired the beauty of nature in its untouched form, and to me this land was the perfect example. The country was nearly level and rich with fertile land. Small prairies were surrounded by oak trees, with very few marshlands and clear streams flowing throughout. The largest of these was the Rock River, which flowed south, followed by Sugar River and Picatonica. The mining region was rolling terrain with plenty of babbling brooks and rejuvenating springs. This land was a sight to behold, the most beautiful and perfect country I had laid eyes on between Vermont and the Mississippi River. In terms of health, the land here appeared much superior to Michigan. When Mr. Henry wrote to me about taking a timber claim in Kentuck Grove, he mentioned having secured all the 4-foot wood to cut at 37 cents per cord. He suggested that we could board ourselves and save up some money, promising to return to Michigan with me in the spring. Not wanting to miss out on this opportunity, I decided to make my way back to Mineral Point. Along the way, I stumbled upon a log cabin 10 miles from any neighbor prior to reaching the Picatonica River. The home belonged to Mr. Shook and his family, who lived on the edge of a small prairie with a plentiful corn crop. After inviting me to stay for a couple of days, we went hunting together and managed to bring in a deer. With plenty of cornbread, venison, and coffee at our disposal, we lived quite comfortably. There came a point where Mr. Shook wanted to kill a steer, and we worked together to get that done. Unfortunately, while we were splitting its backbone with an axe, it slipped out of his hands and left a 6-inch gash in my leg just above the knee. This forced me to stay put for a while, about 2 to 3 weeks, but I was well cared for in his home. When I was finally able to move on, there was already 6 inches of snow on the ground, making the trek quite unpleasant. But in due course, I made it to Mr. Henry's camp in Kentuck Grove, where we swapped stories and then set about the hard labor of chopping wood. We cooked on our own, using potatoes, bread, bacon, coffee, and flapjacks for nourishment. We had no regrets, as each mouthful seemed to taste sweeter than the last. I found myself in the employ of Peter Parkinson, who paid me a meager sum of $13 per month. But alas, tragedy would soon strike him in the form of his beloved wife's passing. She had given birth to their first child prior to her untimely demise, and during her illness, her mother, Mrs. Culleney, had come to provide aid and solace. When the mother and babe were left alone for a brief moment, Mrs. Parkinson inexplicably vanished without a trace. The entire community banded together to search for her, but it was I who stumbled upon the gruesome scene. She lay face down in the spring house, her body submerged in a few inches of water, with the little babe also perished at her side. The entire community was enveloped in a deep sorrow, with Mr. Parkinson bearing the brunt of the tragedy. We laid both mother and child to rest in a solemn ceremony at a nearby grave. After this somber event, I found myself once again in the employ of Mr. Henry, with whom I engaged in selling wood to a man by the name of Bill Park. Mr. Park then proceeded to transform our wood into charcoal, which he sold to the nearby smelters of lead ore. As soon as the ice thawed in the streams, Mr. Henry and I set out toward Milwaukee, where we arrived a few days later. Upon our arrival, I was struck by the small and rudimentary nature of the town. We had to travel out to the steamboat in a small boat, as the water in the stream was too shallow for the larger vessel to enter. Along the way, we stopped to take on food and wood, including several cords of white birch wood, at an island. Our next stop was located in the region known today as Mackinac. A short wharf led to a towering hill upon which a fort had been erected. The wharf was crowded with a hodgepodge of individuals including Americans, Canadians, Irish, Indians, squaws, and papooses. However, it was the fish that caught my attention. The trout were beautifully adorned with red and yellow spots, and each weighed 20 pounds or more. Meanwhile, at the shore, local Indians were preparing a large white birch canoe for a journey to Michigan, approximately 8 or 10 miles away. They effortlessly loaded their belongings in the middle of the canoe, while the papooses perched on top. A man took the stern to steer, while others assumed paddling positions along the gunwale. As the craft glided away, I marveled at the seamless and fluid strokes of the paddlers, which propelled their vessel as gracefully as an eggshell. It was my first sighting of a birch-bark canoe, and I was truly taken with the spectacle. We sailed across Lake Huron in the moonlight, the calm waters seemingly untouched by our passing. As we reached its shallow outlet, the wheels of our vessel stirred up the brown mud from the bottom, a stark contrast to the crystal-clear depths of the lake we had just left behind. Our journey continued through Lake St. Clair, its shores ever-changing as we approached our destination, Detroit. After disembarking, we hopped on the Michigan Central Railroad, traveling westward to the very place where we had worked tirelessly to build the rails the year prior. The memories flooded back as I stepped off the train, the familiar sights and sounds bringing a sense of comfort and familiarity. A walk of 2.5 miles led me to my father's humble abode, where I was welcomed with open arms and hearts. Questions poured forth like rain, each one eager for tales of the wild, untamed country I had journeyed through. I regaled them with stories of vast forests and winding rivers, of creatures who roamed free in clear skies that went on for days. I remained at home until the fall, finding work to save up a little money. But as August rolled around, I was struck down with a nasty case of bilious fever, leaving me bedridden for weeks on end. My dear mother was there for me, her love and care never wavering as she nursed me back to health. As I slowly recovered, I couldn't help but compare the sickly state of this land to the vibrant, life-giving springs of Wisconsin. It was a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of this world, but also one that made me appreciate the gifts of life all the more. Chapter 4. Western Fever. Rumors had spread like wildfire of a land more promising than what lay before us, with the occasional outbreak of Western fever. In 1845, I too was struck with the illness upon hearing the tales of Oregon. The word on the street was that the government was willing to gift a man with a fertile farm in exchange for settling in a land brimming with timber, game, fish, and a splash of adventure courtesy of the Indians. The winters were mild, an ideal climate for my liking. I wasted no time mulling over the idea of the journey and the outfit it would require, but it was clear that I would need at least a couple of years to prepare. California was nowhere on our minds back then, for it did not belong to the United States. It wasn't until the winter of 1848 to 1849 that news of gold in California began to seep through, though it was not widely believed until confirmed by a federal officer. As everyone was accustomed to mines and mining, the gold fever spread like wildfire, a swift contagion. The fever took hold of Mr. Bennett, and he sold his farm. As for me, my Oregon desires were transported to my dreams, where I now dreamed of unearthing the yellow dust. There was nothing for it but a trip, and that was quickly decided upon. Since some weeks were to pass before grass would start growing, I decided to take my canoe and a few traps to a branch of the Wisconsin River to make my way to Prairie du Chien. I would do a little trapping along the way to buy an Indian pony to ride all the way to California. There were no ponies to be had at Mineral Point, so I took a ride on a passing steamboat up the river till I reached Prairie La Crosse, where I found the only house was that of a Dutch trader. I bought a Winnebago pony from him, which he had wintered on a little brushy island. If that pony could winter on brush and rushes alone, I surmised the brute must be tough enough to take me across the plains. I shelled out $30 for the fella, but he was nothing more than a sorry excuse for a pony, sluggish and indolent. However, I held on to a glimmer of hope that some fresh grass and a bit of heft would inject vitality into him, so I lassoed him up and pushed him towards downstream. The Bad Axe River smiled menacingly, engorged with water, but the little guy surprised me by paddling across like a pro. Before departing from Bennett's, I had my firearm remodeled with a pill lock and gathered enough ammo to last 2 whole years. I had even done a spot of tanning on some sweet buckskin and fashioned myself some slick new gear with it. It was at the Bad Axe Crossing where General Dodge and the Winnebago tribe had clashed. At Prairie du Chien, a letter awaited me from Mr. Bennett, warning me that the grass wouldn't sprout for another few weeks, and I should consider coming back to join them later. The tricky part was figuring out exactly when this note had been written, since there was no date mentioned. My original plan was to strike westward and rendezvous with the others at Council Bluffs, but now it seemed like the safer bet to loop back around to Mineral Point and start with them from there. If, by chance, the group had already commenced, I'd just have to hustle to catch up. But alas, the Kickapoo River posed yet another obstacle, gushing too high to navigate by pony. So I got busy ripping some bark off a basswood and rigged together a makeshift raft out of 2 logs, upon which I stacked my blanket and shotgun. The pony paddled across, a natural in the water, but when we reached the other side he scowled and seemed to want nothing to do with it. Before I could even chastise him, he skittered back to the other bank, impervious to my griping. I took the raft back down the stream, chasing after that deceitful rascal once again. But as luck would have it, midway across he pulled the same old trick on me, jumping ship and leaving me stranded. I felt like I was in the middle of one of those tricky puzzles involving a fox, goose, and corn. But I'm not one to give up easily, so I fashioned a basswood rope, tied a stone to one end, and hurled it across to the other side. That was how I managed to send my pony over, using the other end of the rope. After 3 grueling days of traversing streams and facing other hardships, my trusty steed and I finally reached Mineral Point. But as fate would have it, my companion Bennett had already departed 2 weeks earlier, taking our equipment with him. I was a bit disheartened, but not one to be defeated. I set off towards Dubuque with a lighter load. I crossed the river, traversing tough terrains, and finally managed to reach Iowa alone. I spotted some wagons that belonged to a Mr. Blodgett from Milwaukee, and I camped with them for a few nights until we reached the Missouri River. I sped ahead in the last days of travel, reaching the destination before the rest of the group. There were only a few California wagons and some campers. I let my pony rest and graze, then waded across the low river bottom to dry land. I checked the post office and store for a letter, but found none. I scoured the trading places, saloons, and house logs everywhere I could think of, hoping to find some trace of my missing friends. But alas, nobody had seen them or knew of their whereabouts. Dejected, I made my way back to my pony, feeling quite blue. I pondered for a while before deciding to continue on this treacherous journey. It seemed risky to venture any further without a trustworthy train. I sought the advice of a fellow traveler, a certain Chaz, Dallas from Lynn, Iowa, who happened to be the owner of a train. The problem was Bennett had my outfit and gun, and I had his light gun, a small tent, a frying pan, a tin cup, one woolen shirt, and nothing else. I had no money to get another outfit, so I was just about to turn back when Dallas offered to let me drive one of his teams through. In return, he would board me and allow me to turn my pony in with his loose horses. With little to lose, I accepted his offer and put my meager belongings in the wagon. Dallas planned to stock up on provisions in the next town, but we found out that the supplies were depleted. So we followed the river near the bluff and camped near town. Upon entering the town, we stumbled upon a slave state and witnessed the horrors of an African-American auction. On one side of the street, a platform was set up for the black boy, who was only about 18 years old. The auctioneer shamelessly rattled off the boy's good qualities and started the bidding at $500. The founder of St. Joe, Mr. Rubidoux, eventually won the auction for $800, and the boy was sold. As a New Englander, this was a shocking experience for me. We were finally able to get our supplies, but the ferrymen demanded an exorbitant fee of $50 to take the train across. Dallas was not willing to pay that much, so we journeyed back up the river for a day's drive and found a crossing for $30. From that point onwards, we meandered across the country with little regard for the road until we finally reached the Platte Bottom. Driving the team proved to be a little challenging at first, but the oxen and cows eventually warmed up to my kindness, and we continued on our perilous journey. We stumbled upon some of the juiciest strawberries at one of the camps, far away from where we started. As we continued on our journey, we discovered that the land ahead of us transformed into an expansive prairie, with not a single tree in sight until we arrived at the Platte. Even then, the only trees we could spot were cottonwood and willow. At our first stop along the Platte, I found myself tossing and turning without much luck getting any sleep. The task ahead of us seemed daunting. We had to pass through not one, but two forts, New Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, located on the south side of the river. These were the last places where we could procure necessary items like food and medicine, and after that we would be fending for ourselves. We were a small train with just 5 wagons, 10 men, 1 woman, and 3 children. Against hostile Native Americans, we knew we would not stand much of a chance with our current numbers. It would be a dangerous journey, and I strongly considered waiting for a larger group, perhaps with some government troops, who were less likely to be targeted. However, the fear of returning home empty-handed, with nothing but my gun and my horse, outweighed my trepidation. I realized I had to take a chance and move forward, otherwise I'd never forgive myself. If we encountered any hostile tribes, they could have my hair and my trusty gun for all I cared. As we ventured farther down the trail, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The road ahead seemed treacherous, with few bright spots in sight. However, I hoped that my initial impression was wrong and that things would not be as bad as they seemed. Unlike the rest of my travel companions, I had no respite from the long days of travel. While others had 2 drivers for their wagons, giving each person alternating rest and hunting days, I had no choice but to drive alone every day, leaving my gun behind. When we finally reached Salt Creek, the banks were too high to traverse, so we had to carefully lower ourselves down using a strong rope. Once we reached the bottom, we had to double the teams to push our wagons up the other side. Our journey was long, arduous, and often uncertain, but I wouldn't have traded it for anything. As the sun set, we found ourselves in a predicament. Not even half of the wagons had made it across the water, and already the dark of the night crept upon us. By the time we finished ferrying the wagons, the water had risen to a staggering 10 feet. We knew we needed to get cozy for the night, but we also needed to rest our feet on dry ground. Thankfully, we fashioned a makeshift boat out of one of the wagon beds and managed to get everyone across. As we continued our journey, we arrived at Pawnee Village, only to find it to be nothing more than a collection of mud huts. Their oval shape and low entrances made them appear primitive, fit for only animals or small creatures. We found a ground owl and some prairie dogs taking shelter in one of the huts. We speculated that these could be the native people's winter quarters. Traveling wasn't easy, and we divided up the responsibilities to keep the journey moving. Dallas and his family took the 2-horse wagon. Dick Field took up the role of cook. The rest of us were in charge of driving the oxen. We even had a small guard set up at night to watch out for the native people and keep the animals from straying. As we approached Fort Kearny, we found ourselves in a strange situation. A stray horse galloped towards us and joined our own, feeding on the nearby vegetation. Soon after, 2 soldiers appeared, inquiring about the missing horse. Dallas denied seeing any such animal, and the soldiers left without investigating further. We all knew, though, that the easiest excuse would be to simply say that the Indians had taken it. The idea of dishonesty made me uncomfortable, but Dallas seemed content with his decision. He even positioned the stray horse on the opposite side of his own to avoid detection. He walked ahead of the wagon to entertain the officers while we drove past unnoticed. I couldn't shake the idea that we might get caught and suffer the consequences, even if we were not guilty of the crime. My New England sense of morality left me somewhat unsettled. We reached the South Platte, a sandy stream that took us the whole day to ford. We had to first wade through it ourselves to find a good crossing, and then we had to hurry our teams to prevent them from getting stuck in the quicksands. Luckily, we had no mishaps during the crossing. Once we were safely camped on the other side, we spotted a solitary buffalo about 200 yards away. Everyone took off after him, some on foot and some on horseback. The horsemen quickly caught up to the buffalo, but he showed no signs of getting out of their way. They fired their guns, but he still kept his feet. Mr. Rogers, riding a horse with a blind bridle, got close enough to use his Colt's revolver. The buffalo turned and rammed his horns into the horse's thigh, leaving a 6-inch gash. Rogers was thrown off his horse and landed on the ground in a wild scramble. The rest of the group continued to chase the buffalo, firing shot after shot until he finally lay down. We had plenty of buffalo meat to eat, which was a welcome change from our usual bacon. I didn't take part in the battle, but I watched the spectacle unfold. A few days later, we were stopped in our tracks by a large herd of buffaloes. They were crossing our road and heading south. The younger ones led the way, while the older cows and big bulls brought up the rear. We had to wait patiently for them to pass before we could continue our journey. We watched as the great beasts thundered across the plain, their tongues lolling out and their hooves pounding against the earth. It was a thrilling sight, and we couldn't help but stand in awe as they passed within a stone's throw of us. We knew we had to be careful, though, as a sudden noise or movement could trigger a stampede that would be disastrous for us and the buffalo alike. As we journeyed on, we saw many more of these creatures, sometimes in massive herds that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was humbling to witness their raw power and instinctual behaviors, and we were always grateful for the sustenance they provided when we were able to take one down. Amidst our travels, we came across a towering landmark known as Courthouse Rock. It was a strange and imposing sight, jutting jaggedly from the landscape like some kind of prehistoric fortress. We marveled at its grandeur, but also felt a sense of foreboding as we imagined what secrets it might hold. One day we stumbled upon a group of travelers who were unlike any we had seen before. They were rough-looking men with scruffy beards and a dangerous air about them. They were heavily armed, and we couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as we observed their strange and ominous presence. Despite the dangers and uncertainties, we continued on our journey, always keeping our wits about us as we navigated this wild and untamed land. As we made our way along the road, we often passed by graves marked only by small headboards stating that the unfortunate person buried there had succumbed to cholera. Some of these graves had been ravaged by wolves, with the blankets wrapping the corpses partially pulled away. It was a haunting sight, a reminder of the harsh realities of life on the frontier. Our path took us a few miles north of Chimney Rock, a towering column of stone rising up from the earth. It was so perfect and symmetrical that it seemed as if it had been crafted by human hands. Some of our party ventured closer to investigate, but found that there was no way to climb it. The rocky surface was covered in the names of visitors and travelers who had passed that way before us, a testament to the enduring allure of this strange and beautiful landscape. As we continued on, the bluffs grew closer and closer to the river, forcing us to climb up steep hills and navigate treacherous terrain. In other places, the road wound through the bottom of the valley, providing us with a measure of relief from the obstacles in our path. It was here, on the banks of a ravine, that we came upon a large camp of Sioux Indians. The camp was dotted with large cottonwood trees, some of which had platforms built into their upper branches. Upon these platforms lay the bodies of the dead, wrapped in blankets and secured to the poles with a complex network of lashings. It was a strange sight, and we couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and respect for this native custom. The Sioux themselves were a formidable bunch, fair-sized and good-looking for men of their kind. Some of our companions ventured over to their camp to make contact, while a few of their youths came to our own. They were eager to practice their English, though their knowledge of the language seemed limited to a few phrases learned from our ox drivers. We couldn't help but smile as they swung their hands at our cattle, shouting, "Whoa, God damn," with all the enthusiasm of new learners. Despite their reputation as beggars, these Sioux seemed relatively self-sufficient, showing little interest in our supplies or our company. We parted ways with them, feeling humbled by their strength and resilience in a land that could be as challenging as it was beautiful. On our journey, we had the privilege of witnessing some Pawnee Indians traveling across the vast prairies. It was quite a sight to see how they harnessed their ponies to long, light poles with children sitting on platforms at the back, while they were slowly dragged along. As we continued down the road and passed beyond Scott's Bluff, we realized that the game was becoming scarce, and we had to venture back from the traveled path to see any signs of it. The hunters had driven the game away, leaving behind an empty trail. We came across Fort Laramie, a trading post with a few Indian lodges. We noticed that some of the Indians had lighter complexions than the others we had seen before. They had dried buffalo meat, and we decided to buy some. The meat was so perfectly cured that the clear tallow tasted sweet, and it was the best dried meat I had ever tasted. It could have been just my hunger that made it so delectable. Later, we encountered some U.S. soldiers who were traveling to Fort Hall and then to Oregon. We decided to join them for safety, even though they traveled slower than us. Among them were some Mormons who were employed as teamsters and were very helpful during the journey. They warned us about some ill-fated Missourians we might meet on the road. Apparently there had been some tension between the Missourians and the Mormons, and I was relieved that none of us hailed from Pike County. After leaving the Platte River to the north of us, we entered what they called the Black Hills. The first night on this road, we had the most torrential rainstorm that I had ever encountered. Our camp was on a level ground near a dry creek, which quickly turned into an impassable stream. But by morning it had receded as fast as it had risen, and we were able to cross with ease. During our journey we came across a stream with piles of hail and rounded boulders that contained beautiful clear quartz crystals inside. These secondary weapons of nature are called geodes and can be found in various places. We emerged from the river once more, arriving at the Deer Creek mouth, where the coal was plentiful and easy to acquire. We decided to set up camp and spend the day fixing the wagon's tires with John Rogers as our blacksmith. It was an opportunity for me to explore the surrounding terrain, so I grabbed my gun and headed up the treeless creek bed. On the south side of the ravines were gorgeous groves of small fir trees and a thicket of wild roses. As I wandered around, I came across numerous elk antlers and heads, but couldn't determine if they had perished in winter's snow or simply starved. At the crossing, there was a ferry to take us along the northern side of the river. Our man, Mr. Dallas, purchased the entire setup for a modest amount and secured the vessel to the bank with the ropes he had brought with him. The sandy road led us up and over some rolling hills, and as we continued traveling alongside the U.S. troops, we realized we were too late in the season to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains on our way to California. They warned us that the snow would cover the passes by November, leaving us no choice but to winter in Salt Lake. Mr. Dister Alice shared the same thoughts with his family, stating that he would have to let go of his drivers as soon as he arrived in Salt Lake, as he could not afford to board everyone all winter. This was a precarious situation, as I had heard stories about what had befallen the people at Nauvoo and in Missouri. The possibility of being stranded among them with no cash to purchase food was quite dreadful. It appeared that there would not be any work opportunities, and the other drivers shared my concerns and disappointments. In light of these circumstances, we called a meeting and invited the gentleman in charge to speak with us. Our representative briefed him on our predicament and fears and asked for his thoughts on the matter. The man became quite angry at us, cursing and shouting, the gist of his message being, "This train is mine to do with as I please. I don't give a damn what you fellows think or say. I ain't gonna keep you fellas warm all winter with nothing to show for it. Once we hit Salt Lake, you can go wherever you want, 'cause I ain't gonna need you no more." The old man's words hung heavy in the air, his gruffness leaving us with no room for discussion. He stormed off, leaving us alone with our thoughts. As we rode along, we began to discuss our options. It seemed clear that the only way to survive in Salt Lake was to join the Mormons, but none of us had any interest in that religion. We couldn't bear the thought of delaying our journey just to settle down in a place where we didn't belong. Snow started to dust the Rocky Mountains in the distance, marking the onset of winter. We couldn't help but feel a bit anxious, knowing we were only halfway through our journey. Despite the weight of our worries, we found moments of joy in the ridiculousness of our daily struggles. One such moment involved the German mule driver in the government party we were traveling with. He struggled immensely with his team, but his poor command of the English language made it difficult for us to assist him. Whenever the officers tried to give him instruction, he would become agitated and spout something that sounded like Sacramento. We couldn't decipher the meaning of that word, as some had heard it was a river name and others thought it was Dutch for swearing. However, if it was indeed the latter, then this mule driver was one heck of a profane man when angered. The company's head honcho had a stunning dame on his arm, and they toted a grand wall tent which they used when they made camp. The company's chef served up chow for them in their tent, and they appeared to be enjoying each other's company quite fine. Everyone seemed to reckon that the captain was one fortunate soul to have such a polished partner and to journey to the gold fields on Uncle Sam's dime. There was a touch of envy between the captain and the lieutenant, though, and one day I caught sight of both of them standing crossly before the captain's quarters, both mounted and with their carbines slung across their saddles. They exchanged some pretty snappy and heated words, and it looked as if they were on the brink of firing at one another. At one point the lieutenant made a slight movement with his right hand, and the captain was quick to draw attention to it, hollering out, "Put down that gun or I'll put a hole in you," all the while grabbing his own and pointing it straight at the other officer. The whole time this was happening, the captain's lady was standing in the doorway of their tent, and when she saw her favored man had the upper hand, she clapped her dainty little hands together in a cheerful fashion and chirped, "Look at the captain! Ain't he gutsy?" And then she cackled long and loud, finding it mighty amusing to see her lover display so much bravery. She appeared more delighted by the spectacle than anyone else. I can't say for certain what the others thought, but I never could bring myself to believe that the lady and the captain were ever legally wed. The lieutenant wasn't any sort of craven or anything, but he probably reckoned it was wiser not to draw his weapon. The two soon rode off in divergent directions. As we made our way along the Sweetwater, we spotted a solitary rock that stood proud in the riverbed. The name Independence Rock had been bestowed upon it, as it bore the markings of countless travelers who had passed by before us. Names were etched into it with varying degrees of craftsmanship, from skillfully chiseled to hastily scrawled, and some even daubed on with paint. I spent every spare moment scouring the rock for Mr. Bennett's name, but it eluded me at every turn. To find it would have brought a measure of relief during those trying times. Some of the inscriptions even included dates, indicating how close they were to reaching the gold fields. As we continued forward, we stumbled upon alkali water along the road, a treacherous hazard for both man and beast. We trudged on up the Sweetwater for some time until the road eventually led us away from the river, up a rugged incline. After much exertion, we found ourselves in the South Pass of the Rocky Mountains, the spine of the American continent. To the north lay tall peaks blanketed in snow, while to the south rolling hills and valleys unfolded before us. The summit of the mountains was not as impressive as I had imagined, but it was, undeniably, the summit. Soon enough, we began our descent down the western side, as the waterflow led us towards the Pacific coast at Pacific Springs. The next day we came across the almost dry bed of the Big Sandy River. The land around us was barren and volcanic, devoid of any trees, but punctuated by an abundance of sagebrush. Hunting the occasional sage hen, we trudged through the sandy riverbed, which proved to be a quagmire in the rare spots where there was enough water to wet it. We finally reached the Green River, crossed over it, and made our way onto its two tributaries, the Big Sandy and Little Sandy streams. A beautiful, crystal-clear stream lay before us, flowing rapidly and invitingly. Its waters were now low enough to cross by foot, so one of the government teams took the lead in making the crossing. They chose a spot where the water seemed shallow enough, but the led mules lost their footing midway and were forced to swim. The wagon halted, and the team became entangled in a terrible mess. After they were unhitched, the wagon was pulled back, but not before the water had seeped into the box by about a foot. We decided to camp here and rest for a day, giving us ample time to survey the area. As we approached Pacific Springs, the first water source flowing towards the Pacific coast, the drivers gathered to discuss a new idea. We presented many ifs that led to this question. If we had a boat that was large enough, if we knew the way, if it was free from any hazardous areas, if we had enough provisions, if we were brave enough to embark on such a journey, could we reach some spot on the Pacific Ocean? When we stumbled upon a stream that was large enough to navigate with a small boat, we began to ponder the other ifs. During our travels, we stumbled upon the second if, in the form of a small ferry boat clogged with sand on a shoal. It didn't take us long to excavate and refurbish it, and it was just sizable enough to carry one wagon at a time. Our military escort planned to depart at this location as their path veered off to the north of ours. I had a good long chat with the surgeon, who seemed knowledgeable about the land, and I asked him about our prospects. He spoke poorly of the Mormons, cautioning me not to reveal that I hailed from Missouri if I were to visit Salt Lake City. "Many who hail from that state will never make it to California," he warned. He reminded me that the Mormons were chased out of Missouri and would seek revenge if given the chance. Both the surgeon and the captain assured us that the stream flowed out to the Pacific coast and that we had only to worry about cataracts, which, they had heard, were quite treacherous. So I went to Dallas and shared our plan with him. To my surprise, he did not object, and even offered $60 for my pony. He promised to sell us some flour and bacon for provisions, and we helped him cross the river, which proved to be quite challenging with its swift current and boulders. Nonetheless, we managed to get everything safely across and proceeded with the trade we had arranged earlier. Dallas paid me for my pony, and we took what flour and bacon he was willing to part with. He also gave us some ropes for head and stern lines to our boat, along with a couple of axes, which we stacked alongside our provisions on the roadside. 6 of us surrender our whips, and although Mr. S. McMahon hesitated for a while, he eventually threw down his whip and said, "I'll join the boys." That left Dallas with only one driver, and he took a whip himself, relying on the aid of his children and wife to maneuver the 2-horse wagon. I footed the bill for the provisions we took, as my companions had little to no money. Then we said our goodbyes to the group, watching as the little train of soldiers and merry young lady headed toward Oregon. We, on the other hand, settled down on the riverbank, knowing that we were on our way to the vast Pacific. We exchanged well wishes, took a deep breath, and got to work, determined to realize our dreams. Chapter 5. Assuming the role of captain.